Good morning. My name is Madison Hazen, and I'm a writing studio tutor here at Delaware State University. And today we're going to be talking about definition essays and going over how to navigate those and kind of what those look like within your academic career. This should serve as just a resource for you to get the general concept. And additionally, there'll be a handout to kind of help you navigate this process as well. So first, just an overview of kind of what a definition essay includes. You're most of the time going to start with the purpose, and we'll get more into this further in the slideshow, but you're going to start with the purpose of kind of why you're talking about this word or what the purpose of this word is for um, in, in conjunction with your essay. And then we're going to look at the structure and kind of how a definition essay should be set up because it is a little different than your typical essay. And then we're going to go over some tips for writing a definition essay, and then we're going to look at an example. So like I kind of mentioned, the purpose. So a definition essay can do a couple different things, and it kind of depends on the specifics of what the course may be asking you to complete for your assignment. But generally speaking, a definition essay can define a term, concept, or idea. So most of the time when this happens, you're defining a term and kind of going further in depth about it. And we're going to talk about kind of some strategies that you might use when you're writing this kind of essay. So hopefully that will make a little bit more sense as we progress in this presentation. But also a definition essay can explain a term to an unfamiliar audience. This is kind of similar to like when you are writing any kind of essay, you want to act as if the audience doesn't know what you're talking about and leave nothing up to interpretation. So for the purposes of a definition essay, you are going to be defining a word and acting as if like the audience has no idea what the word means, or maybe they're not, maybe a different connotation associated with that word. And then lastly, your definition essay might be to fully explain a concept before making an argument about it. So this is usually paired kind of like two styles together, and that's a little bit more complex. And like I said, it all depends on the requirements of your assignment and such. But for the general purposes of this presentation, we won't get into that. But also a definition essay is a rhetoric style that's often paired with other styles. So kind of like I said, it could be paired with that argumentative type of essay. But the rhetoric style is really going to kind of allow you to be able to define the term and use that connotation and denotation to further explain, which again, I'm going to explain a little bit further on in this presentation. So now looking at the structure of kind of how you set up a definition essay. So the most basic setup would include an introduction, the main bodies, and a conclusion. So depending on the rhetoric styles, there may be more paragraphs. If you have the definition and argumentative, like I talked about, you may have a lot more paragraphs. It kind of just depends on how you're setting it up for your assignment, and they're all dependent. Like I said, they're all dependent on the assignment requirements. So, but the most basic form is the introduction, main body, paragraphs, and conclusion. Something I like to tell people when they come to the writing studio for help, because a lot of people struggle with setting up and organizing their paragraphs. As long as you meet the requirements for your assignment and you express everything that's being asked of you within those requirements, it truly does not matter how many paragraphs you have unless there is a hard limit or a hard minimum that you must meet. As long as you are meeting the requirements and you express what you're trying to convey, I try and tell people to keep that in mind. So that's kind of why for the main body paragraphs, I put 2 to 3 because it really does depend. So now looking at the introduction. For the introduction of a definition essay, you're going to want to give some background on the topic. So in our example later on, it goes a little bit further in depth, and I know this may sound silly, but if you have a word that might be unfamiliar to some people, you want to give a little background on like where that word may come from, or like why you're talking about that word, why it's important to what you're writing about. And then you want to define the topic, and then you want to make a thesis about it. So now looking at the body paragraphs for a definition essay, this is going to look a little bit different. And these are some tips that I actually um, I, I borrowed from Excelsior University. And you're going to use, there's a couple different techniques you can use, but they recommend that you use them within each body paragraph. So like body paragraph 1 would be enumeration technique, and this is characteristics or listing qualities of the definition topic. So this would be talking about a word, for example, and then you would list all the characteristics and qualities like that go within that topic. And like I said, depending on what you might be writing about, this might be good for something where you're pairing it with like an argumentative essay because you're setting it up for like what you're talking about. Negation technique. This is describing what the topic is not. So giving the opposite example of what it is not, so the audience understands kind of like maybe so they don't get confused with something else that might be similar. Um, and then an analogy technique. This is showing a comparison of something similar to the topic. So again, associating that with like within the reader's mind, and really you just want to try and paint a clear picture of what the word that you are, what the definition is that you're talking about, and painting a good example of, you know, what you want the reader to know for the purposes of your essay. And then looking at the conclusion, you want to just summarize the definition again, summarize the main points you talked about in your body paragraphs, and then you want to restate your thesis. So here are some tips. These are some more, aside from the other 3 techniques that I talked about for the flow of your paper. You don't have to use those 3 techniques. To me, they just seem like they would be where you would get more writing material from. But you can also use denotation, which is down here on the second row, and that's just using the straight definition from like a dictionary. And honestly, you will do that in your introduction paragraph, which is why I think that it's better to use in the introduction rather than your body paragraph. But the connotation can be a very effective technique for the definition essays, especially in rhetoric style essays, because connotation is giving associated meanings that that might be with society. So it might be aside from what the actual dictionary definition is, but connotation can be very powerful depending on the purpose of your essay and kind of like what you're trying to get from the reader. But connotation is another technique you can use. And then another technique that I added is just brainstorm before you write. I always tell people when they come into the writing studio and they don't have an idea of what to write, to get a piece of paper and start jotting down ideas and kind of mapping it out that way. It's extremely helpful, and it really does help your process in writing. So now looking at this example, you can kind of see the highlighted areas where they use some of these techniques that I talked about. So for this third comment right here where my cursor's at, you can see the denotation where they use the actual dictionary definition. So they say exploration and the ideas reveal the complexity and contradictions of happiness. According to Oxford Dictionary, happiness is da 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 da. That would be denotation. And that is how they began their introduction paragraph, which I think is extremely important to, lay the table and just state exactly what you're going to be talking about. And then further down, you can see they use connotation here. So the statement, I just want to be happy, similarly suggests happiness is an elusive feeling of pleasure associated with a set of desirable circumstances. Happiness requires smiles, laughter, and a carefree spirit, whereas contentment suggests appreciation and peaceful despite imperfect conditions. Surely, if you could tire of feeling peace and desire internal agitation instead. So this is a good example of that connotation. You're talking about the associated feelings that come with that word, and that could be opinion based, but it also could be based on society norms. And this is really, really strong for somebody who is writing a rhetoric piece. And then here we talk about, they have the enumeration. So this is happiness is a euphoria of new relationship or the elation of a good grade. It stems from a day without responsibilities or a beautiful family moment. So again, they're listing those qualities and characteristics that come with that word. And this is this is their first body paragraph. So that was the technique that they used for their first body paragraph, was the enumeration. So like I said, I would stick to like one technique per paragraph. Um, and then in your conclusion, you would just summarize all of those points that you had, your thesis, and then conclude with a final statement. And this was my reference that I used. Again, I was talking about the Excelsior University. It's associated with Purdue Lab, which is a great resource. But I would like to end this video by saying thank you again for watching, and that if you have any questions, you can visit the Writing Studio on the main campus or the downtown location